So I shift and I put on my other hat now as a moderator of the panel. And I'm only, since the other individuals participating are already introduced, my only task now is to note that we're set for about 55 minutes, and that would, before the Q&A, and I'm informed that after each of the panelists speaks, we may do one more round of the panel to allow anyone to respond to any other panelist, and maybe there'll be some colloquy, and then it will be opened up to the questions. So without further ado, I have not been informed otherwise, therefore I shall proceed in the order in which the panelists are listed, and that means Professor Sloan is first.
Thanks, Robert, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here this morning. Well, clearly Canada has an interest in the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. Our interest is in maintaining the region open to the smooth flow of trade. That's the Canadian-specific interest, and we also have an interest in ensuring our allies have a secure supply of energy. And we know that regional allies like South Korea and Japan are highly dependent on the smooth transit of oil and gas through the region, through the Straits of Malacca, for example, and the South China Sea. So in both cases, in ensuring Canada's access to trade and in ensuring the open sea lines for energy, the issue is to maintain the open sea lines of communication through the Indo-Pacific region. It is, in other words, a maritime environment. And so when we talk about security and defense in the region, from a Canadian perspective anyway, we're largely talking about the Navy, a Canadian maritime environment in the region, and what Canada's Navy can contribute. Well, Canada's naval engagement in the region increased almost as soon as the Cold War was over. Canada started to focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Diplomatically and also militarily, we started to send naval task groups to the Asia-Pacific region, and we did this throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. Our ability to do so was then dramatically curtailed by the loss of our supply ships, which became old and eventually decommissioned, and a naval task group cannot deploy independently without a supply ship. And of course, we are in the process of rebuilding that aspect of our fleet. So less engagement, I would say, during the early 2000s, but then a refocus, at least at the diplomatic level, after the Obama administration's announcement of the pivot back in the fall of 2011, and a speech by Hillary Clinton, and then rephrased as a rebalancing rather than a pivot because it wasn't received too well in Europe. Canada, at least diplomatically, started to focus more on the region, and we also started to try and step up our naval visits, etc. Quite recently, we had a defense policy review come out last June, a year and a half ago, in June of 2017. And the strong, secure, and engaged does highlight the Asia-Pacific region. It says things like Canada's committed to being a reliable partner in the region through consistent engagement, strong partnerships, that it will maintain strategic dialogues with regional powers, high-level visits, and be engaged in regional exercises. And Canada is also seeking, has been seeking for some time now, a membership in the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus to participate in that regional dialogue. Well, this strong, secure, and engaged document, that's in essence what it says, which isn't very detailed on actual capability as to what Canada is actually doing in the region. And in fact, Canada's Navy is increasingly concretely engaged in the region. Just this past year, we sent a submarine to conduct operations in the Asia-Pacific, the first time we have done so since the end of the Cold War. And that submarine just came back in the last few months. We have an operation called Operation Protection, where one of our state-of-the-art Halifax-class frigates is in the region now on a continual basis. One comes back and the next one comes, about 6-7 month deployments. So we have a frigate over there at all times. There have been calls for Canada to permanently deploy a submarine, a frigate, and perhaps a long-range patrol aircraft in the Asia-Pacific. And this is a perspective with which I agree. I think that would truly consolidate our commitment, not just going over on a continual basis, but being deployed there permanently. Canada has participated in every Rim of the Pacific exercise since they started in 1971. And so just the one that finished in the summer of 2018, we contributed a pretty sizable force, a couple of frigates, a couple of maritime defense MCDVs, Maritime Coastal Defense Vessels. We also had the Asterix, our interim supply ship, was in the region. We had land forces in California and then air forces based around an Aurora in the Asia-Pacific region. And one of the things that our frigates and our long-range patrol aircraft focused on during that exercise, which is for about 5 or 6 weeks, I believe, in the summer, was anti-submarine operations. So anti-submarine warfare is a growing focus of the Canadian Navy. Canada also held the deputy commander position. Canada closely cooperates with the U.S. Navy, of course, and it has for decades. It can seamlessly fit its ships into carrier battle groups. But more recently, it has stepped up its cooperation with other allies in the region, notably the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, where it has conducted exercises, for example, in the summer of 2017, and recently signed a cross-servicing agreement for our naval vessels. With respect to China, Canada is focusing on diplomatic outreach and also limited exercises. One of the things that I think Canada needs to think about in the future is freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Right now it operates only in international waters, but its a position in this area is something that Canada needs to consider in the future. And I'll leave my comments at that.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Boutillier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me begin, like the others, in thanking the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. The maintenance of energetic and informed and connected think tanks is vital for the health of our nation. Sadly, we have a long tradition of creating think tanks, but leaving them very much on their own without adequate support from the community and from governments and from private industry. And I'm delighted to see the turnout. This is absolutely important, absolutely critical in terms of maintaining the level of dialogue across the nation. And I congratulate the MLI and its director. Let me enumerate 10 issues very quickly that I think relate to this larger discussion about energy, and then conclude with a few editorial comments on the question of Canada and its place in the larger energy picture. First of all, we're in, I would suggest, a truly revolutionary era in terms of energy. And why is that the case? Well, of course, what we've seen is the shale gas and oil revolution, which has suddenly meant that the United States, far from being way behind Russia or Saudi Arabia or other oil and gas producers, is now one of the premier producers of energy in the world. What does this mean in terms of the larger architecture of energy globally? Secondly, we're on the very cusp of the electric vehicle transformation. What Tesla is doing, what others are doing, is in fact scheduled to dramatically affect the energy profile for nations and for regions around the world. We're only at the very beginning, but I am certain that this, despite the vicissitudes of Tesla and other competitors, this is in fact the wave of the future, and it has enormous implications in terms of energy flows. Thirdly, I would suggest that environmental awareness continues to rise, but in many cases we find environmentalists pitted one against another. So thus, if you go to China, you find environmentalists arguing that there should be less and less energy expended because of the pollution. And then if you go to British Columbia, you find environmentalists actively campaigning against the export of what is a relatively clean energy source, LNG, to China, where it would reduce the levels of pollution. So we have always to consider the environment in terms of the larger issues that we're examining in the energy flows. Subsidies, if we go to Indonesia, if we go to India, what we see is that the government is committed to spending huge sums of money to subsidize energy, so that it is available to the rank and file in those great nations at an affordable cost. What we've seen in recent years is a steady diminution in the cost of oil and gas, and this in fact may very well have the effect of resulting in the governments of countries like Indonesia and India in no longer bearing the enormous burden of subsidies. The geopolitics of energy is clearly implicit in the comments of the keynote presenters and the panelists, in the sense that one has constantly to consider what are the geopolitical considerations, for example, of Russia's Nord Stream to Germany in opposition to that flow of energy from Russia, or comparable plans for the Turkish South route, and so forth. We also need to bear in mind that after years of uncertainty, Iraq and Iran are beginning to come back into circulation as energy sources. How does this affect the global energy market and pricing accordingly? Tariffs. We have no idea really for the moment what the tariff wars, which are mooted in Washington and elsewhere, are going to mean for energy flows. A 10% tariff on energy placed by China. What does this mean in terms of the viability of gas exports, for example, to China? We have to bear in mind, of course, that China and India are colossal markets, absolutely colossal. I always think of the fact that Greater Chongqing in China has a population equal to the whole of Canada. That's one metropolitan region. So we have to begin thinking in terms of entirely different scales when we look at the question of the world energy map. What about Russia? Russia with a GDP equal to New York State. Russia desperate to generate revenue. Russia, in fact, opening gas fields in the Arctic, subsidized in part by China, and now with the warming of the Arctic, we're beginning to get the beginnings, the very beginnings of trans-Arctic energy shipments. Recent shipments of gas from the Miao Peninsula all the way to Brazil. What does this mean when Russia begins to come online in terms of its Arctic sources? And coal. Coal is king in Asia. When I was in New Delhi not so long ago, it was 448 on a 500-point pollution index. It was like living in the bottom of a birdcage. And that's what's happening in China as well. New Delhi, I think, has surpassed Beijing momentarily as one of the world's most polluted capitals. But what we see, there's an old saying in China that the emperor, or the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. The provinces are beginning to continuing with energy projects which are in direct opposition to directions from Beijing. So we have in the works in China an almost 25% increase in coal-fired production in China, at the very moment that the leadership in Beijing is dedicated for pollution reasons, for public health reasons, to in fact wean itself off coal. And meanwhile, of course, on the east or on the west coast of Canada, we're still debating what to do. Should we in fact be exporting a relatively clean source of energy, liquefied natural gas, to Asia? The old frontline markets, Japan and the Republic of Korea, are basically flatlined. But India and China are taking off in terms of LNG. A few years ago, I had the good fortune of going to Vancouver to address 700 international lawyers, and I said, if there's one word that you remember from my presentation, and only one word, it's urgency. We have parlayed prudence into paralysis. Everything is NIMBY on the West Coast. we're on Prozac, watching the clouds go by, and out there is a hardwired world, incredibly aggressive in terms of marketing Australian gas or Qatari gas or Brunei oil or whatever into the Asian markets, and we're asleep at the switch. We need some real rectal dynamite to get us moving. And I'm very, very serious about that. There are environmental considerations, absolutely. There's not been a single spill on the BC coast in 50 years involving tankers. Will an increase in tankers mean a greater likelihood of spills? Possibly so. What I'm saying is that we have to take a much broader view of what's happening globally, where we position ourselves as a nation in terms of overseas markets. Bear in mind the dozen or so variables which affect the way we make these calculations, but we've got to get moving. Possibly the announcement in the past 48 hours is in fact the starting gun in some real LNG exports into Asia. But this is a very powerful, very competitive game, and curiously enough, it could be, to use that terrible Chinese expression, win-win, it could be a win-win situation in which we help China and India begin to wean themselves off that terrible addiction to coal. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful overview and with expression, which we all appreciate. Mr. Cross.
Yes, thank you. My remarks are going to be briefer, possibly because I'm focusing on the economics of this, particularly for the oil and gas industry. And the economics of this, I think, for Canada are a lot more straightforward and a lot simpler than perhaps some of the geopolitical considerations. The basic problem with both our oil and gas industry in Canada is the exclusive reliance on the US market for exports. The majority of our output of both gas and oil is exported, and 99% of those exports go to the US. However, while both of these industries suffer from similar problems of over-reliance on the US, the exact nature of their problem is different, so I'm going to do a brief summary of why the natural gas industry is different than the crude oil industry these days. For natural gas, they've had to face the problem of the fracking revolution in the US for a lot longer. US production of natural gas has increased from 50 billion cubic feet a day in 2005 to 75 billion last year, an increase of 50%. As a result of this increased supply, we've seen our market share decline in the US. Our exports over that period are down about 20%. So overall, with all this gas flooding into the US and demand relatively stable, there's inevitable downward pressure on prices, which have fallen from about $8 in 2007 to $3 today. Now for crude oil, the story is different, but the end result is the same. The problem in crude oil is that we're producing more and more. Oil sands production in particular is increasing steadily. The problem is this is flooding a US market that's already digesting increased domestic output and is limited by the small number of Midwestern refineries that are able to process crude petroleum. Therefore, with increasing supply flooding a market with limited demand, there's been the inevitable downward pressure on prices. While the world oil prices have recovered to about $70, the discount we receive for our oil exports has increased from $22 early this year to over $40 recently. This discount is costing Canadian oil exports at least $14 billion. That's based on some very conservative assumptions, as more likely north of $20 billion. The competition from US shale oil will only increase. The International Energy Agency's latest 5-year forecast calls for, quote, a major second wave of US shale oil, raising its production to 17 million barrels a day by 2023. So this problem isn't going to go away. In fact, it's only going to intensify over the next few years. Predictably, the combination of weak exports and falling prices for natural gas and oil is hurting investment. Investment in Canada's oil and gas industry has fallen from $80 billion in 2014 to $40 billion in 2018. Not all of this decline can be blamed on the decline of oil prices over this period. For example, in the US, we saw oil and gas industry investment rise 37% last year due to the fracking revolution. Hopefully, Tuesday's announcement of massive investment in BC's LNG industry shows there is a solution for our exclusive reliance on the US market. As our natural gas exports to the US have fallen over the last decade, LNG holds the promise of opening up Asian markets where fossil fuel demand is forecast to increase for decades to come and prices are higher than they are in North America. The green light for natural gas exports to Asia shows such projects are commercially viable. The same solution is possible for our oil exports. Instead of exporting to a captive US market at a discounted price, we could export our oil to Asian markets if we found the will to build pipelines such as Trans Mountain or Northern Gateway to get Alberta's oil to the BC coast and on to Asia. The willingness of Kinder Morgan to build Trans Mountain shows that such projects are commercially viable. Not only would this increase the price we receive for our oil and gas exports by tens of billions of dollars, these increased revenues would stimulate new investment in our oil and gas industry, which is still the largest source of investment in Canada's economy. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Koyama, please.
Oh, yes. First of all, I'm very honored to attend this the meeting. And my name is Koyama. I'm a general manager of the Vancouver office, JOGMEC. JOGMEC stands for Japan Oil, Gas, Metals National Corporation. This is one of the Japanese government institution whose goal is to secure stable supply of energy and mineral resources to Japan. To meet this goal, our main objection is to assist Japanese companies by extending the financial and technical support in the field of the oil, gas, minerals and coal all over the world. In Canada, JOGMEC has conducted several joint venture exploration projects in the field of the metals and the coal. And also we provided the financial support to Japanese company. This slide showing that we provided the financial support, the $1 billion equity capital, and also $2 billion liability guarantee in the field of oil sand and the shale gas. That means JOGMEC is also one of the big investors to Canada. So I would like to talk about some point from viewpoint of the investor to Canada. So as you know well about the decision of Federal Court of Appeal about the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion project. And in that decision, the Federal Court pointed out the 2 points. One point is about the environmental impact assessment of the increasing the number of the ships. And other one is the due to consult. So I'm very keen about the due to consult with First Nations or indigenous people, because from the viewpoint of the business, so uncertainty is very problem to go inside the business or not. And of course, I would like to say I'm very much respect of the rights of the indigenous people. But from the business, the government require to do consultation with the First Nations before starting the big infrastructure project or big mining or natural resources development project. But so showing this case, after got the consultation, Indigenous people has a chance to appeal to court, and the decision is bent on by the federal court. So that is uncertainty. So some people say, so government should change the due to consultation to agreement or consensus. So, of course, this is very much difficult to get the agreement with the First Nation, but the level of the uncertainty will go down. So, this is one point I would like to discuss this matter. And another point is the infrastructure. So, about the, of course, pipeline, not only pipeline, but also the port or capacity. I would like to show the, please, another slide. Alison, another slide. Okay. So this is showing about the Japanese import change of the crude oil, and also the dependence of the Middle East. So we, Japan, started to import crude oil from the Middle East in 1960s to support Japan's the high economic growth period. And after we experienced twice of the oil shock in 1973 and 79, at that point, so the government decided to take the two policies. One is the make the diversification of the supply countries, and another one is energy saving, promote energy saving policies. So we started to import from the crude oil from China and Indonesia at the time. So in 87, after these policies, we succeed to reduce the dependence of the Middle East. That came the 67.9%. But, however, unfortunately, the dependence is going up. And in 2003, the dependence almost reached to 90%. There are several reasons why the dependence came up. One of the reasons is these developing countries like China and Indonesia use their own crude oil to domestic demand to support their own economic growth. And also the energy saving. That is the second stage we faced. This is very difficult to get the more efficient or the decrease in the energy saving. And 2010, we started importing the crude oil from the Far East Russia. At the time, a little bit the dependence decreased, but nowadays that stopped, and also the dependence goes up. This meaning to decrease the dependence from the Middle East is very difficult for Japan. And another slide, please. This is showing about the LNG import. We started the import LNG from the US, that is Alaska, in 1960. And now the quantity of import is gradually increased. And now we are getting almost 77% from non-Middle East countries, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and Papua New Guinea. And as you know, so last year, the US started to export LNG to Japan. And I very much expect from Canada, the mid of the 2020, we will start the import from Canada LNG. So this is meaning in case of the LNG, is the depends of the Middle East is very low. This is a success story for the geopolitical issue. And next slide, please. This is just the primary energy consumption in Japan. So I'd like to showing this one in 2011. That is happened the Great East Japan earthquake, and after that our nuclear power generation has stopped, and instead of the nuclear we use the LNG and the coal. That means we have to keep that this stable energy from the outside. And last one, please. This is Japan's new energy mix, which this year our government decided. So in 2030, we still use the LNG 27% and the coal 26%, but the oil just 3%. And the nuclear we'll expect 22 or 20%. So this is the meaning what I intention. We have to get still the stable supply in LNG and the coal more than 10 or 20 years later. So that means we very much interested in the west coast of the Northern America. But regarding the coal, especially cooking coal to make the steel, Canada has a very rich and very high quality cooking coal in west coast, but unfortunately the capacity of the export is limited. As you know, the U.S. also has a good deposit of the coal, but either they don't have the capacity of the export port. So which country is become to our partner? Of course, now Canada is exporting, but the limited is very quantity is very limited. So we very much expected the Canada invest or arrange the more expansion of their port or rail to transport the coal from the inside of the west part and export to Japan or the Asian market. This is a second point I will say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuriyama. As indicated, we'll do one more round of the panel. I might suggest that if any of the panelists has a predisposition, an urge, or a wish to adumbrate questions that have not been mentioned in the panel or in the keynotes, that as we are then going to progress to the question and answer period where the discussion will presumably range rather more widely, do not please hesitate to bring those considerations to bear on any remarks you have. And we will go back again in the same order as first, and therefore, Professor Sloan, the floor is yours.
Will we have the chance for a final statement as well, or
Before or after the questions?
after at the very end?
That's not for me to say. I've not been informed that you will have such an opportunity.
Well, okay. So I should give my final statement now. The only thing that, now, Robert, you mentioned in your comments that perhaps I would talk about the Arctic, and so I thought that I would just raise that now since we haven't discussed that. In terms of energy security, where that fits in to, I guess, global energy security is, of course, the substantial resources that are thought to be at on the ocean floor. When Canada looks at the Arctic, we look at it in terms of wanting to maintain sovereignty through the region, of ships going through the region. We look at it in terms of shipping lanes, and then, of course, there's the energy dimension. In my view, the main interest of powers such as China is right now in shipping lanes. I mean, you hear an awful lot about China in the Arctic right now, but in my view, it's primarily an economic one driven by access to shipping lanes as they come opening up. Long term could be concerns over competing interests in oil and gas on the resources on the ocean floor, but right now, the U.S. Geological Survey indicates that those resources are within the 200-mile zone, and so hopefully they would be resolved peacefully. So that's the only comment I wanted to make, is that when it comes to access to energy and oil, right now I don't see conflict in that region over that particular issue, but rather growing activity in the region through wanting access to shipping lanes.
Thank you. James.
Thank you, Robert. Couple of quick points. We need to keep our eye focused as well on renewables. Renewables is a very small part of the overall energy mix for most countries, but renewables are beginning to gain momentum, whether it's solar or wind or other renewables, whether you get it from geothermal sources and so on, that it's usually 2 to 5% of the overall mix. But as we move forward, I think globally we're going to see these renewables take a bigger and bigger stake in the overall energy mix. I think that nuclear, for all the difficulties attendant thereto, does have some future when we look forward in Asia. In the Arctic, I would suggest that almost all the activity is going to be on the Russian front. In northern Canada, it's all bark and no bite. There are companies there is some shipping, but the Northwest Passage is particularly challenging in terms of any shipping, and the real issue for the shipping companies is scale. They want big ships, not small ships. Venta Maersk just went across the Northern Sea route, across the northern flank of Russia, but that's only 3,200 TEUs, containers, and in fact they only actually carried about 600 on the ship. It was an exploratory or reconnaissance trip. Maersk is not particularly interested. But the Russians are beginning to get into the game with some major ice-breaking capability. Ice-breaking LNG ships that don't need icebreaker accompaniment. And so we need to focus on the Novaya Zemlya, Yamal area in the future in terms of gas production from Russia, but not, I would suggest, in the northern part of Canada. One footnote I would suggest, and that's a revolution that's occurring in the maritime realm, that with the support of the International Maritime Organization, more and more shipping companies like Maersk and so on are beginning to look at the climate change gas emissions from big ships. And one never thinks about it because they're out of sight, out of mind, but in fact they do contribute fairly significantly to the global array of climate change gases. And so we're going to see new regulations which will oblige shipping companies to use cleaner fuels more and more gas at sea, and even renewables that will be employed. And there's a little footnote in the sense that 5 or 6 years ago, the United States Navy actually began to look increasingly at using recycled fuel, which was low in the production of climate change gases for warships. So this is another part of the overall energy mix. Thank you.
Thank you. Philip.
I'd to amplify my comments about the decline in business investment in the oil and gas industry by particularly highlighting the drop in the foreign direct investment component of that. We saw, in particular after 2014, almost all the major multinationals sold off their oil sands assets. We even saw an increasing, then because of the increasing problems of getting regulatory approval of a pipeline and the discount for our prices, we saw firms in Canada shifting their operations to the US. That's why I think the investment by foreign companies in the LNG is particularly important. These projects are so large, whether they're in LNG or oil sands, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars. That is beyond the capacity of Canada to finance. We're very good at raising government money in bond markets in Canada, but our capital markets are nowhere near as well developed as the US. We need money from abroad to finance these big projects. So I think we have to be particularly sensitive to the foreign component of investment.
Thank you, Philip. And Hiroshi.
Yeah, just one word. So I want to again, so Asia market really want the Canadian resource. That's all.
All right, well, thanks the panelists. I am informed as the question and answer period, if you will raise your hand, a microphone will appear. So please.
Just introduce yourself.
Thank you.
I'm very sorry, but of course, if you might possibly identify yourself, and if you do direct your question to one or more of the panelists, please tell us who they are so we can give a direct answer.
Okay. I'm Philip Schubert. I'm an energy consultant focusing on developing countries. My comment and question is directed to, I think, the 3 Canadian-based panelists. It has to do with the fact that LNG Canada, to my understanding, is really more LNG British Columbia. As the pipeline, if I'm not mistaken, starts at Dawson Creek, and I don't know if there's a connection to Alberta. I don't know if there's anybody here particularly focused on Alberta. Dr. Boutillier certainly outlined the fact that Alberta, I think, is suffering under the circumstances, and I guess that the recent kerfuffle with Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Canada, the actual import of Saudi Arabian oil was conveniently not affected, unlike the other threats that were exchanged. And so I guess my question to the 3 panelists, the Canadian-based ones, is given the fact also that in the conclusion now of what's now called the USMCA in place of NAFTA, adding to CETA and to the Asia-Pacific Partnership, the comment made was, it's about time we had free trade now between the Canadian provinces. And so I think it's about time that the markets were opened up for all of Canada, not blocked by political interests or economic self-serving interests. And so my question to the 3 panelists, the Canadian-based ones, I don't assume that the representative from Japan probably dares to enter into this debate on this issue, is what can we do to finally allow a province like Alberta to have the same advantages as a province like British Columbia, which happens to have a coast, unlike Alberta? So that's my question.
Thank you. What can we do? If you may I put and add to that? And what is the likelihood, I think, is implicit in your question as well. So which of the three, Philip?
I'll start with, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for BC now to argue against the pipelines for oil to the coast. How can BC sit there and say, well, we understand that we need to diversify our markets away from the US, and it's okay for our fossil fuels to have a pipeline and to ship to Asia, but then turn to Alberta and say, we will deny the same advantage to you. I think that just increases the stress in Confederation. I think it makes the BC government look hypocritical. I will at least say the Greens are consistent in BC. They say they're against the fossil fuels, whether it's natural gas or oil. But consistency aside, I think it's very difficult for BC to argue that this is okay for our fossil fuels, but it's not permissible for Alberta's fossil fuels.
Eleanor, I think I saw you nodding in affirmation of what Philip was. Do you wish to elaborate on that nonverbal signal?
My specialty is security and defense policy, so I'm really going out on a limb talking about provincial economic policy. But my sense is that a way of approaching it, rather than a centralized approach, rather than the Prime Minister and the 10 premiers getting together as they have many times in the past and trying to address issues, is perhaps a more grassroots approach. Alberta working with BC, Alberta working with Saskatchewan, going across in that, working with the province that's closest and perhaps opening up barriers at that level before going and slowly moving to a national, consistent national level across the board.
That makes good sense. Jim, anything to add?
Well, knowing absolutely nothing about the issue, that qualifies me ideally to comment, I think, Robert. We, I think, derived some hope when we had governments of the same political stripe in Edmonton and in Vancouver, Victoria. But this certainly did not work in favor. I mean, having NDPs in office in both settings didn't facilitate, I think, a greater understanding. And this is a piece of tragic unfinished business, the barriers that balkanize Canada. And why, and I have not explored this in any detail, why we haven't addressed this more aggressively, I don't know. But my basic message is that out there is a hardwired world that's exceedingly aggressive. And we may, in fact, be trying to count the number of angels on the head of a pin, but unless we begin to address these issues with a real sense of urgency, we're going to be left very, very far behind. Because while the markets in Asia for energy are almost insatiable, there are limits. And we're going to arrive and discover that the door has already closed.
Well, thanks all three of you for those comments, and thank you for the question. Is there next? I see a hand here. I see over there, please.
Thank you very much for the panelists. It was very informative. My name is Nader Yama. I'm the charge of Afghanistan Embassy. I want to look to what has been discussed with focus on Indo-Pacific, but also the role of Afghanistan, both in terms of security and stability in the framework of proxy wars, and how those countries in the Indo-Pacific were affected by insurgency. But also from the perspective of regional connectivity and how Afghanistan plays a role to connect the Central Asia rich, resources-wise rich countries to South Asian poor resources countries. And third, on the self-reliance of Afghanistan, talking about the shift where insurgency used to be supported by external resources, whereas now that shift has happened in terms of more of insurgency trying to enrich their operations from internal resources when it comes to opium or illegal extraction of minerals. But also the potential that Afghanistan has in terms of lithium, one of the largest countries, but also in terms of coal, environmental issues, but also an opportunity for Canada to open market, not only to focus, shape the stability and security, but also supporting self-reliance of Afghanistan with more of promoting business and trade. For the last 2 years, I've been looking to attending PDAC conference and many other fronts, but less of seeing that Canada's focus, where Canada exists, in partnership in different areas in the region. How you see Canada's shift in that perspective, and particularly how it affects the Indo-Pacific, perspective and focus on geopolitical and energy-focused competition and perspective. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Afghanistan is not technically, of course, an Indo-Pacific country as it has no coastline, but it still plays a very important role, as you say, in connecting countries which do. And it, in fact, has borders with countries that do, as well as with the resource-rich countries of Central Asia. So would any member of the panel wish to address either the role of Afghanistan in the Indo-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean in the first instance, the interest in very rich material resources in Afghanistan in the second instance, and any possible role Canada may have either in developing those resources or in peace and security operations? Does anyone,
I can start
please?
Off. Yeah. I again focus more on the defense side. I can comment on the shift because Canada was, of course, heavily involved in Afghanistan for many years, for about 10 years, I guess. And then after 2011, drew back our contribution and then withdrew completely in 2014. And had a strong counterinsurgency role and then moved towards capacity building. Now, within NATO in general and in Canada, a certain degree of exhaustion in terms of missions around the world, and you can see it in Canada's approach to places that are not Latvia or the Asia-Pacific. So in other areas of the world, what Canada is focusing on is defense capacity building. It's a NATO term. It's a term that Canada focuses on a lot as well. So NATO has a mission in Afghanistan trying to build forces, to build the Afghan people's ability to take care of internal security issues, as I know you are aware. So the capacity building within the country. And that's NATO missions. Canada's not even there, actually. That's how much we've drawn back. But we are focusing on defense capacity building in other areas of the world. We just took on the Iraq mission, and we're in different places in Africa. There is a relationship, you're right, that the shift away to other things that are going on in the world, and we're focusing increasingly on the Asia-Pacific. I think it's part of the current Trudeau government's third way. Of course, the first Trudeau government in 1968 focused on the third way. The third way, a very familiar term, but just in case you don't know, either focusing on the status quo, increased trade with the United States, or the third way, which is other places around the world. And so the current Trudeau government is responding to things like the signing of the agreement with the United States by focusing on places like the Asia-Pacific and China, and increasingly focusing its limited military assets in that region. And then finally, Latvia, and the rise of Russia, and so our military contribution has gone towards the Baltic states and addressing that security concern there, with the result of all this being that Canada is simply not engaged in Afghanistan as it once was, and indeed I think should be in the future.
Yes.
I had the good fortune of being in Afghanistan in the golden age when Zahir Shah was still in power, and just to demonstrate that it's actually possible for a nation to in fact be in a state of peace and relative good order. But sadly that was long ago and far away, and we've had a very long and tragic and turbulent interval since the early 1970s. What we've not discussed at all in this session is China's grander ambitions, that while China sustains the Middle Kingdom construct surrounded by lesser mortals, China is doing something truly unprecedented, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a grand sort of pharaonic tribute to the great Xi, the third member of the emerging Chinese triumvirate. But that Belt and Road, which has maritime and terrestrial dimensions, that is to say sea routes across the Indian Ocean and through the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and beyond, and trans-Eurasian links, road, rail, pipeline, and so forth, has enormous energy implications. Also, what we see, tragically, and the Muslim world has been almost thunderingly silent on this issue, is the apparent incarceration of perhaps upwards of 1 million Turkoman people in Xinjiang in Western China. It's astonishing that the Muslim world has not raised almost a single comment of opposition to what the Chinese are doing. But China is beginning now to move into Pakistan in an enormously powerful way with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which will bring energy, and this is part of the whole politics of transit countries, bring energy from the Middle East through Gwadar on the Baluchi coast of Pakistan, north to Kashgar in Western China, into the heart of the Uyghur or Turkoman arena of Western China. And what we're seeing is, I would think, the steady colonialization of Pakistan by China. Pakistan only has 2 months of foreign exchange reserves. It's teetering on a knife edge, and Chinese influence continues by its very nature to grow when you put $50 or $60 billion. And Pakistan is the key to Afghanistan, sadly. I commend to you Steve Cole's book, Directorate S, about the directorate in the Pakistani ISI, the intelligence community, which basically operates extensively in Afghanistan. And that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for Western interests, commercial interests, to become involved, because they don't know what game Pakistan is playing. And China is now beginning to look at Afghanistan in its larger security concerns. It's already involved in mining operations in Afghanistan. And there was long ago a grand pipeline scheme which cut right across Afghanistan to the sea, but that was abandoned in the turbulence of the first decade of this century. But there are many opportunities, but the track record, sadly, in Afghanistan is one of sufficient instability. And we can see that spilling over with Iranian involvement in Western Afghanistan and even into the Baluchi areas of southwestern Pakistan, where the integrity of the pipelines that are part of the trans-Pakistani system will be very much held to ransom by Baluchi tribal politics. So your point's well taken, and we do need to be very sympathetic, I think, to Afghanistan's legitimate long-term interests. But the history of Afghanistan in the past 30 years is not one, I think, which encourages Western investment very quickly.
I'll add one comment about, I don't know anything about Afghanistan, but mentioning the Belt and Road Initiative raises I think it's the inevitable Chinese response to, right now, all that oil coming from the Middle East and gas coming from the Middle East to China is guaranteed by the U.S. Navy. And as tensions between China and the U.S. grow, I think it's entirely a rational response of China to seek out other transportation routes that aren't dependent on the goodwill of the United States.
If I may, I concur, and there's been a real angst about the integrity of that truly significant keyhole, the Strait of Malacca, through which thousands of ships ply every year. But there are alternatives. I mean, they're diversifying their energy sources out of Russia, out of Pakistan, or through Pakistan, through Burma, and so forth. But there are other ways around the Strait of Malacca which are still within economic models. So I agree that if they go through the Strait of Malacca, the Chinese are committing themselves to a dangerous strategy in some ways, but in the future, if they wanted to, they could move shipments by alternative routes, avoiding the Strait of Malacca altogether.
Thank you. Next, this one here. Sir.
My name is Bob Haig. I'm a fellow at the Global Affairs Institute. I wonder if, and I like Dr. Boutilier's statement about we've made prudence into paralysis. I'm wondering if any of you can comment on the legislation that's currently going through the House about the abolition of the National Energy Board based in Calgary. And seemingly something, I don't have the right name, the Environment and Economic Impacts Board, something that analyzes the whole impact of these projects. I assume they're oil and gas projects. I'd be interested to know if electricity is included, which we also export from Canada, by hydroelectric electricity, which also has a climate impact because it relies on cutting down millions of acres of trees, which are of course sinks that absorb greenhouse gases. But this board that might be coming in the future, if it goes through the legislative process, I assume might have an impact on the LNG Canada project, and it'll be different from what the National Energy Board has done. I'm not sure if this is a sense of more paralysis or it's just a good common sense to take into account in the process the impacts of these various projects. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, I wonder if we could sort of keep answers to maybe a minute each. We might have time to fit in one more question.
Yes.
I think there's, for the LNG, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this construction began on this project yesterday, that it had gone through the existing regulatory process and was approved. And but the other problem is nobody really knows what this new process is going to look like. As for electricity, boy, I don't think Quebec is going to tolerate for 1 second the idea that they need federal approval of their hydro projects. I think if the federal government tries to impose that, we're going to have one hell of a fight in our hands soon.
Anything else from there? Yes, we have time. I saw originally there are 4 hands, 2 plus 2. I saw one on that end and one on that end some time ago. I might suggest that the gentleman with the microphone may wish to take the floor.
Thank you for taking my questions. I'm glad that to be joining this panel speaker, which have giving more experience on how oils and energy is working around in globes. So my question is not going to be too long, but my question is, what can you tell me as your experience in oils and in globals about the young nation like South Sudan is one of the richest with the oil and golds and mineral, which we use it for cell phones. So where the South Sudan can be pitting in this global energy around the world? Thank you.
Who wishes to take that?
Well, I'm no expert on the South Sudan, although I think that the challenge will be the relations between the 2 elements of the Sudan and also the neighboring states in terms of transit rights. This is going to be your big challenge, I think, in terms of moving energy out of the South Sudan.
Maybe one more question.
One more. I see the microphone migrating in this direction here.
Edward Atraji, National Research Council, retired. At a minimum, we probably import about $10 billion worth of oil from Saudi Arabia every year. It doesn't make economic sense when we have oil in our backyard and our front yard. Saudi Arabia was mentioned several times here, and I'm just going to take a different tack. What if we were to say to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran, we will boycott your oil until you change your way of sponsoring global terrorism. And we will send a statement to other nations that if you import the oil from these countries, we will also boycott you. Are we able to do that as a united front, Western democracies? Can we do it? And if we do it, we probably will change the course of the way the world is going today. Maybe we'll stop terrorism entirely. Thank you.
So just to be clear, you're speaking of a Canadian declaration, or are you speaking of a Western common front, as you put it?
Common front, obviously.
I guess I'll just, something that I think would be good, but unlikely. First off, it would, of course, increase oil prices, and consumers would not like that. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's probably the right thing. I think it's unlikely if you just look at the reaction to, the worldwide reaction to Canada's, Christina Freeland's tweet that led to Saudi Arabia denouncing Canada. Our allies did not speak up on our behalf. And why? Because they have interests. So while I agree it would be a good thing, I certainly don't see it happening in the near future.
Any further? So with apologies to those who had not the opportunity to put their questions, I'm confident that there will be further occasions where you will have that opportunity. And Mr. Crowley, the floor is yours. Back.
Thank you, Robert. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the speakers and Q&A portion of today's event. Before I ask you to join me in thanking all of our speakers, I'd just like to mention that we're delighted, given the focus of this event on the geostrategic, the global significance of Canada's resources, to see, for example, the diplomatic community here in Ottawa so well represented, including by the Ambassador of Japan. We enjoy a very positive and collaborative relationship with the embassy, and of course the embassy of Afghanistan, the embassy of the Philippines, and others. There are, of course, people from the security community here, from the military, from the civil service, from parliamentary staffers, and wide range of people here. And we're glad that this conversation has attracted your attention, and we know that it will reverberate throughout not only Ottawa, but the country. Please let me ask you to join me in thanking all of our speakers, Hisashi Ikeda, the President and CEO of Mitsubishi Canada, Robert Cutler, who not only spoke but so kindly moderated the panel, Eleanor Sloan from Carleton, James Boutelier, as those of us who have some experience of Nova Scotia pronounce it, Boutelier if you're a civil servant struggling to convince people you're bilingual. Philip Cross from MLI, where he's a senior fellow, and of course Hiroshi Kuwayama from Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corporation. Please join me in thanking all of them. And finally, let me thank all of you again for attending. I look forward to seeing you at future MLI events, including our next one, which is on silent invasion, understanding China's influence operations in the West. That's going to take place on October 16th, again at 10 in the morning at the MLI offices. Those of you who've been there before know that that's 323 Chapel Street in Sandy Hill. And at that event, we will be featuring, amongst others, the notable Australian author and authority on China's influence operations in that country, Clive Hamilton. And there will be a distinguished panel moderated by the Globe and Mail's Robert Fife. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much for coming.